Hello, Bron. It's good to have you part of this series called The Future is Calling Us to Greatness. I've been looking forward to this call for some time.
Me too.
Cool. So, Bron, could you please, Connie and I know you personally, we're friends, colleagues. I think your book's The Greatest Things in Sliced Bread, Dark Green Religion, but a lot of our listeners and viewers may not be familiar with your work or your book. So could you please help us give a sense of who you are and sort of what you bring to this conversation and sort of what your gifts are? So don't be bashful, just help us get who Bron Taylor is.
Well, officially, I'm a professor of religion, nature, and environmental ethics at the University of Florida, as well as a fellow of the Rachel Carson Center for Environment and Society in Munich. That's far less important, I think, than what I've been interested in my whole hybrid academic and activist life, and that is trying to figure out what might lead to dramatic mobilization around the host of challenges we face today, especially environmental and equity related, and I've got a special passion for the conservation of biological diversity upon which all life depends.
Oh, that's great. I mean, one of the things why I consider you such a soul brother in this work is that you just articulated for myself. I mean, obviously, I don't have the creds and the professional involvement that you do, but that deep and passionate commitment to a healthy future and to not just climate change or not just, some of the other large-scale issues, but also this intergenerational justice and where we've been out of right relationship to nature and to other species and how to bring about change to bring us in there. So I'm curious, let's explore a little bit. First of all, for anybody who's never heard the phrase dark green religion, could you give us a sense of what that is and who are people for whom that would be a label that they could easily say, wow, yeah, I've never heard of that, but that's me,
Sure. Well, dark green religion is a term I made up and I chose it because it had a certain kind of double meaning, and I like double meanings for book titles and the mystery of them. And on the one hand, it refers to people who have a deep sense of belonging to nature, a sense that, and typically folks who use religion-related rhetoric to describe their sense of belonging and connection to nature, such as nature as sacred, nature as sublime. People who understand that all life is deeply interconnected and mutually dependent. People who, usually informed by an evolutionary understand that we all got here through precisely the same processes. We're deeply related at a biotic level. We share a common ancestor, and thus we are quite literally kin. Mm-hmm. And of course, kinship brings with it all sorts of ethical responsibilities. Of course, those ethical responsibilities differ depending on how close our kin are, but we have widespread obligations to, I think as Aldo Leopold put it, to live and let live, to the greatest extent possible, allow all other living things to flourish. Mm-hmm. That's a very common perception within what I've been calling dark green religion. And those sorts of basic ideas and understandings, I argue in the book, have been spreading with special alacrity since Darwin penned On the Origin of Species. For some, that kind of understanding of the unfolding of the cosmos and of biotic evolution, as you very well know, can be a self-standing, sufficient form of spirituality. Mm-hmm. For others, it's possible to graft those sorts of stories, those sorts of understandings onto long-standing religious traditions and to hybridize them. Mm-hmm. And what I do in the book is I look around the world and I think I'm finding and have documented that these sorts of understandings and this kind of story is spreading rapidly around the world. It's not something that just one social class, ethnicity, religion or geographic setting is predominant, but actually wherever these sorts of understandings have spread, people are in very creative ways adopting them. Mm-hmm. And there is a strong ethics that's easy to surmise from these, this kind of live and let live ethic, which really forces us to think carefully about how we might live more equitably with our own species. And it really forces upon us the notion that we ought to be doing everything we can to prevent the currently unfolding and intensifying extinction episode that unfortunately our species is the one responsible for.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, that was great. One of the things that I've been calling religion 3.0, which is sort of this factual faith or sacred realism, sort of ecological evolutionary sensibilities. And as you say, and that's been my experience as well, is that there are people for whom this deep core sense that nothing is more important than living in right relationship to reality, as evidentially understood and collectively discerned.
Right.
And doing so in a way that's a blessing to future generations, that's a contribution to future generations. That core sentiment, those core set of values and priorities and commitments really do unite tens of millions of us, possibly hundreds of millions of us around the world, some of whom, as you say, and I experienced well, they don't need any other traditional form of spirituality or religion or practice that's sort of sufficient for themselves. But then there's others for whom they've remained Buddhist or Hindu or Catholic or Quaker or Baptist or whatever, but they have this deep sense, however they interpret their religious tradition or their spiritual path, they do so within an ecological evolutionary sort of milieu, a commitment. One of the things I appreciated about your book is that you'd really do, in the various chapters, you go through sort of where dark green religion, as you're saying, what I'm calling religion 3.0. I realize I probably should define that. Religion 1.0 is the authority of elders. Religion 2.0 is the authority of Scripture. And religion 3.0 is the authority of evidence. That is where our best understanding of what's real and what's important isn't old man nor old books, but through all forms of evidence collectively interpreted. So I see that there are, so I'm seeing modern day evidence as modern day Scripture or as authoritative guidance or whatever, however you want to talk about it. But you do that really brilliantly in very different ways. So could you give a little bit of sense of sort of the diversity of people for whom these values and this sense of this commitment to a sustainability ethic, a land ethic, a bioregional, or just a right relationship to reality ethic, where that has shown up in various segments of society and where it shows up now?
Maybe one way into this would be just to talk a little bit about my own sort of pilgrimage through social groups and inquiry. As a young man, I got very interested in the so-called liberation theology movements in Latin America that were primarily promoting social justice and rebelling really against authoritarian political regimes there. Not always in ways that proved to be the most effective or even just in of themselves, but nonetheless, these movements for social justice in those places. Now, I knew enough about those places to know that and to feel that there was something very much missing from the bulk of those movements. In other words, an understanding that their well-being and their aspirations were deeply dependent on their natural surrounds, but they really they're mostly influenced by kind of leftist political thought, which, truth be told, has been largely human-centered, anthropocentric, and not that nature-centric, we might say, or biocentric. So I began to notice, though, that there were a few people who had been moved by those sorts of traditions that began to integrate and nature into their understandings. And a few early people in the early 70s began to talk about not only the liberation of human beings, but the liberation of life itself. but still, those were largely folks in the Christian tradition, and they were very much a minority in the Christian tradition around the world. And so I began to wonder, where might there be greater traction for a much more holistic emergence of movements of social conscience that would take our dependence on environmental systems more seriously.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And I was also increasingly aware of the global extinction crisis, and I wondered, well, where are people actually getting it? Where are people actually responding to that? And I noticed around 1980 a group of rebels that are now known as the radical environmentalists who were challenging the dominant ways of thinking and acting and the dominant social and economic systems. And so my curiosity perked up, and I went to find out more, and it became clear very quickly that there was for most of those activists, there was a kind of deep spiritual connection to nature that was the fundamental ground of their activism. Now, I'm working on a book still about that movement. We'll eventually come out with a book on that movement, and there's I think, a significant amount to praise and also a significant amount to criticize with regard to it. But I was very impressed then and remain very impressed with the way in which a love of nature was the fundamental ground of what they were about.
Yes.
And I was also impressed with the very diverse sources that this very plural movement was drawing upon for their activism.
Mm-hmm.
So then I began to wonder, well, is this just a North American phenomenon? They had an attitude towards social movements emerging in what we now call the global South, Latin America and Africa and so forth. And I wasn't sure that their perception of it was accurate. They were sort of saying, well, these are our soulmates in Latin America and Asia and elsewhere. So I began to study environmental movements around the world, did a book called Ecological Resistance Movements, and began to notice that despite significant differences, there were some patterns beginning to emerge. And then I was privileged to go to, as you can tell from the Dark Green Religion book, to a wide variety of places around the world and to be engaged with social movement actors there. And indeed, I began to notice certain kinds of patterns emerging, certain sorts of understandings emerging that made it possible to see a global environmental movement that is sharing certain sorts of perceptions, beliefs, and values. And as I said before, that there's a lot, academics love to focus on difference and contention and so forth and so on, and I think that can be a very important thing to do. But I think the penchant for that has led many analysts to not notice points of convergence, points of common understanding, social movements that are not bickering but collaborating and figuring out how to do so effectively. And I also became increasingly interested over the years in the ways in which the arts were both expressing and promoting these sorts of values, and indeed the ways in which they were expressing and promoting contemporary scientific understandings. So I've spent a significant amount of time looking at the ways in which these ideas are expressed and promoted outside of what we might call traditional, the world's predominant traditional religions, but how there's just a host of what the sociologist Paul Ray and his wife calls, Shirley Anderson calls, the cultural creatives, people who are using their gifts, whatever they might be, sometimes film, sometimes poetry, sometimes novels, documentaries, animated films, and so forth and so on, to both express and promote their understandings and their hopes for a greener and more socially just future. Mm-hmm. So part of what I've been arguing is that at least if we begin to project based on the last 150 years of cultural innovation a century, 2 or 3 or 5 down the road, and ask ourselves, what do you think the majority of our species is going to understand in coming generations, in a few centuries? My hunch is it's going to be wildly different from what the majority thinks and believes today, because these emerging new paradigms, they're sensory, as you were talking about earlier. They're based on reality, and so there's whatever people's cultural backgrounds or religious backgrounds might be, if you can engage them in authentic encounter and give them, and if you're provided with the opportunity or have the chance to bring this kind of reality-based worldview to them, a very significant number of them will figure out ways to embrace that. And I think we're seeing that, and that's where I find both some significant inspiration as well as encouragement.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, me too. I mean, again, what I'm calling religion 3.0, or sort of factual faith, is where we find our inspiration and we find the worldview that gives us access to the feeling states that humans have always needed to thrive, such as trust when we look to the future and a passionate commitment to ensuring or doing what we can to ensure a healthy future, gratitude to the past, and inspiration to be in action in the moment, where most humans, for most of human history, where they sourced those feeling states that the human animal can't thrive without, have been various belief systems. And yet there's now a fast growing number of people for whom where they find what gives them trust, gratitude, and inspiration and solace and other feeling states that are important for human thriving is evidence, is our best scientific understanding of reality and our best understanding of scientific evidence, historic evidence, and cross-cultural evidence. So the cross-cultural aspects there as well. And I think we're in a new axial age, a new religious transformation that 1,000 years from now, looking back, assuming that we don't destroy ourselves from climate change or some other means, this new sort of evidence-based ecological evolutionary forms. Right. I mean, I think 100 years from now, there's still going to be Christians and Muslims and Buddhists and Jews. Right. Yet they're going to the vast majority will fully embrace an ecological evolutionary worldview. So they'll find ways of integrating that. And there'll also be those for whom traditional religious forms don't work, or for whatever reason, or they just don't inspire for them. But some form of dark green spirituality or earth honoring faith does. And so I'm wondering, either in terms of your personal story, or just sort of like a menu, like what are just give a sense. I want to give sort of a bird's eye view of who are the various movements. What are some of the names or people or authors or movements that you see this emerging sense of what you're calling dark green religion and what I'm calling religion 3.0?
Well, it's hard to know where to start. I mean, I would certainly start mention in Western history the emergence of the Romantic movement, which, of course, some people like to criticize, but that was a response to the rapid industrialization and the desacralization of nature that I think emerged first and forcefully in Europe as a kind of a dissident movement there, and then was picked up and elaborated on and moved in new and creative dimensions in North America, and has had all sorts of interesting manifestations. I mean, I hardly know where to talk about. We can talk about specific figures, but I don't think we have a whole lot of time to sort of go through the kind of history that I laid out in the Dark Green Religion book. But I guess I would first start with if you look at the people who have been most influential around the world in different social contexts, in articulating and inspiring movements for ecological and social justice, and especially the hybridized forms of those, you'll find that they are articulating and feeling things that are very similar one with another. And so I guess one of the first places I would be looking would be for those environmental movements in those figures. And honestly, when I think about the Dark Green Religion book, I think I'm a good synthesizer, but I don't think in some ways that I'm doing much more than identifying and reflecting what's already coming up organically from the grassroots of social movements from around the world. Mm-hmm. Now we also have, so that's kind of the grassroots energy, but there's an interesting synergy and mutual influence between the grassroots and what we might call the intelligentsia. The grassroots appropriates ideas from the world's intellectuals, and I think to some extent the world's intellectuals also appropriate and learn from and are inspired by the grassroots. So I like to look at both people who are doing innovative things at the grassroots and people who are articulating these visions intellectually. So that sounds a little vague, and I can get more specific as time allows. But those are some of the things I like to examine.
Sure. Yep. Yeah. I mean, for me, it's as simple as who really loves Earth, loves life, and is committed to a just and healthy future, not just for humanity, but for the larger body of life upon which we all depend and of which we're a part. And wherever that shows up is to be applauded, in my opinion, and where that is lacking. I mean, I interviewed, another interview series that I did 3 or 4 years ago was called The Advent of Evolutionary Christianity, where I interviewed 38 of the world's most highly respected leaders, Catholic, Protestant, evangelical. I mean, some of us were naturalists, some of us were supernaturalists. I mean, we had the whole gamut, liberal and conservative. And yet we all had a deep time understanding of reality, what I call deep time eyes. We all had a global heart and a global commitment. And we all valued evidence as in some very real sense divine. Divine guidance, divine communication. I mean, some felt comfortable, like I do, calling it modern day scripture, but just, you know, that we don't privilege ancient mythic texts over current evidence in terms of our understanding of what's real and what's important. And all 38 of us, I mean, even the evangelicals, all 38 of us agree, you know, had deep time eyes, a global heart, and a valuing of evidence as in some very real sense divine. And so that's, you know, I find that encouraging because we don't have time to convert each other at the belief level.
Yeah, I think part of what's happening is many people are working toward a critical correlation between the best that we can know through our senses, in other words, scientifically. But that's not just science in the kind of modern science with all the sophisticated tools. That's also the sciences of people around the world over long periods of time who have been engaged in the careful observation of natural cycles and what happens when you mess with them. Right? Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So we know that there's lots of civilizations and small-scale societies as well that have deep and profound understandings of how things work, right? Mm-hmm. And one of the problems has been this disjuncture between Western scientific modes of knowledge and what we might call indigenous or the modes of knowledge of indigenous people, tribal
participatory
people. Yeah, and the truth is that people are smart everywhere, and we need to increasingly bring these different sorts of folks together for authentic encounter and mutual learning.
Yes.
And that's hard to do when human beings are so siloed around the world. And on the other hand, as I talk a little bit about in the book, we have unprecedented opportunities for that today through the kind of communicative technologies that have unfolded. And so I think we're seeing that. And even if we look at some of these networking sites, I mean, some people thought, well, this would just reinforce our insularity. But the social scientists who have looked at this have discovered that no, that, people are networked in so many ways that actually people are getting more information and sometimes disconfirming information through those sources that they would not be getting otherwise.
Yeah, yeah.
So I think the realities of the situation also are simply pressing themselves on us. I mean, they are inescapable. And despite the economic interests who are investing heavily to create confusion about what's going on, gradually, all too gradually for our taste, but nonetheless, gradually, and I guess I would say in fits and starts, depending on the latest batch of headlines, people are beginning to understand that we have been heavily insulting the environmental systems of the biosphere, and that we really need to address those things. So on the one hand, you could say, well, we're not moving fast enough, and that's absolutely correct. On the other hand, you could say that the changes in understandings are happening at a rate that is unprecedented. Now, you talked about how you think we're at the cusp of a new axial age, and I just wanted to piggyback on that because one of the lectures I give around the country these days is, I think I call it Spirituality After Darwin, is the main tagline. And in it, I start off that talk by asking people to imagine if you were out there in the world when the great axial age prophets were teaching and you had run across them, and you'd seen, Jesus on the hill or the Buddha in the forest, would you have said, oh, I know that a very large part of the human population is going to be that guy's followers in 2,000 years? Probably not. You think, oh, there's another interesting new spiritual voice. Maybe I'll go check him out. Mm-hmm. I think most of us probably would not have been so acute as to recognize the significance of that figure. Mm-hmm. And I think today, when we talk about a kind of ecological and ecology-inspired spirituality, most of us, present company accepted, are not recognizing the extent to which we are really at the cusp of an absolutely huge gestalt shift in human consciousness. And I don't mean that in some kind of new age way, and I'm not all that optimistic about the human species present term and medium term. But we are learning creatures, and I take some comfort in the environmental anthropologist Roy Rappaport, who once, I think, almost flippantly said that maladaptive human cultures kill their hosts. Well, you flip that over, where human beings have developed cultures and understandings that are reality-based, they figure out what their manners are in a place, and they develop rich and flourishing livelihoods and lifeways.
Yes.
So I think ultimately, I'm not one of those who thinks that despite how much we're insulting the biosphere that we're likely to die out as a species. We're very creative. We've obviously proven that we can live in all sorts of pretty harsh habitats. So I don't think we're going away, at least anytime soon. But I do think that we're coming into some very severe bottlenecks, and that on the backside of those, inevitably, there's going to be some very profound learnings, and we are of necessity and inevitably going to learn our planetary manners.
Yes.
To me, the real question is, how much unnecessary and tragic suffering is there going to be between now and then?
Yes.
And our calling, I think, you would agree with me, is to do everything we can to prevent as much of that as is possible.
Yes, amen, amen. Well, I love you're giving me some new language, heavily insulting the biosystems of the planet. I love that, insulting the bios, because I think having an I-thou relationship to this body of life is essential, and we all know what it means to be insulted, and we can relate to that. And then learning our planetary manners. Several of the other people that I've interviewed in this series, Richard Heinberg, of course, and his commitment to a post-carbon future and the Post-Carbon Institute, Jim Kunstler, The Long Emergency, and my favorite writer, I think my favorite writer of all is probably John Michael Greer. I just have read about 8 of his books, and he speaks about the long descent, that we're in this process of this contraction. We talk about the collapse of the Roman Empire. Well, took 400 years. It was every decade was a little worse than the previous one.
Right.
And we're seeing that kind of contraction, but he has this vision of an ecotechnic future, kind of what I think Thomas Berry was trying to get at in terms of the Ecozoic era. And it could easily take 2, 3, 4, 500 years to get to there. We've got to go through a sort of a salvage industrialism, or perhaps even, I forget, he's got an intermediate one, but before we get to sort of the ecotechnic future. I agree. I think we're very adaptable. We can survive, but I'm committed in my lifetime to doing everything I possibly can, given my unique gifts and limitations, to, as you say, ensure as little suffering, unnecessary suffering as possible, both for humans and animals, and to gracefully, or as gracefully as possible, make this transition. That it's going to take some time.
Well, one of the points of intersection I just also thought I would piggyback on with your work, your and Connie's work, is I think you've done a great service in looking at the ways in which people who are, on the one hand, secular, and on the other hand, are still what we might say traditionally religious in some way, can, in their own ways, come to some common understandings.
Yes.
And I do think that's, certainly some conservative religionists are rebelling against modern understandings because they view them as threatening. But as you well know, that's not necessary, and that there are folks who are figuring out how to do some interesting blending here. What I talk about toward the end of the Dark Green Religion book, borrowing from my friend, the political theorist Dan Dewdney, is the possibility of a Terrapolitan Earth civilization or Terrapolitan Earth religion emerging over time, in which people from a wide variety of religious and non-religious philosophical perspectives would be able to come together around certain sorts of shared understandings. And it seems to me we can keep this pretty simple. We are all, to use a little religious language that you'll recognize, we are all absolutely dependent, whatever else we might be dependent on, we are all absolutely dependent on the living systems of this biosphere.
Yes.
And so even just for purely prudential, self-interested reasons, we can make a compelling argument to people from whatever their backgrounds are, that we need to to ensure that the diversity and the diversity-dependent fecundity, resilience, and services of these environmental systems remain healthy.
Yes.
I mean, that's not a hard sell if we can get in the room with our interlocutors, which really is everybody on the planet.
Right.
So I see potential for, again, I'm not sure what the time frame is, but I think we see it in fragile and nascent stages in all sorts of places. Mm-hmm. And there's other things we know from political science, that you don't have to win everybody over to win politically in a democratic discourse. There's a relatively small political strata which is highly influential. We can see in our own country how influential this minority of Tea Party activists are. I think there's close to an equal number, if not an equal number, of equally passionate Greens out there, but whose overall approach tends to be, less aggressive. Mm-hmm. And I think that less aggressiveness comes in part because of that whole kind of metaphysics and ecology of interdependence, Exactly. So part of what I've taken some inspiration in is movements like the 350.org movement, and others that have saying, we've got to get more uppity about these things. We have to, I argued in World Watch, and it was interesting that they even wanted something from me in World Watch, on resistance. Mm-hmm. And on, why isn't there a massive social movement, a March on Washington scale movement of people demanding action to prevent climate disruption? Well, I think we're seeing some of the early stages of such a movement emerging and it just needs to be as rapidly multiplied
Yep.
as possible.
Yep. Yep. I agree.
My judgment.
And I'm encouraged by that. Bron, what gives you, like on a day-by-day, week-by-week basis, where do you find your deepest inspiration to be in action? Where do you find your, what is it that feeds those feeling states that help people thrive for you?
Well, that I guess drives me to a more personal side of the thing. I think that, like a lot of folks, I didn't have an easy time as a youngster. And like so many people, I had a pretty dysfunctional family situation. And there were times when, just to get outside of the craziness and the violent nature of it, I just had to leave. And I was fortunate to live near a marine ecosystem. And I found myself on a number of occasions just going down to the beach and sitting out on a jetty and looking out over the ocean, watching the anchovies jump, listening to the birds and other wildlife around me, feeling the waves rolling in and looking out over a vast star-filled, if it was a clear night, horizon. And I just got a sense that, this human stuff just isn't all that important in the grand scheme of things. So there was a way in which, I'm no great mystic and I'm no great, religious figure, but there was just a sense that there's something really cool, if mysterious, about this universe. And there's something really awesome about it and even right about it, despite our pettiness and our wounds and often our inability to get along. And I think that, to put it in a simple way, just a kind of love of nature emerged through that, and a feeling of contentment in that place. And I guess out of that came a sense that, it just is all so glorious. It all just matters.
Amen,
it just sounds
brother.
so simple. It just sounds so simple, doesn't it?
Well, you're speaking my heart, so I'm with you.
All life matters. And those are the sorts of experience that just gave me those impressions. And there's others too, the chance, the privilege to sometimes be in some relatively intact biological systems where if you're alert, you just get a sense of the exotic intelligences that are there. And that even the feeling of just great energy in an old growth forest.
Yes. Oh.
And, I'm aware that I'm a privileged guy to have had such experiences, and in this urbanized world, a lot of people don't. But those are the things that, even if I don't get out there very much, they still drive me. Those sorts of connections still drive me, and I want to try to share those experiences and those possibilities with folks.
Yeah. Amen. Well, you did a pretty damn good job in your book, Dark Green Religion. So
thank you. Really appreciate that.
So here's the question that Connie wanted me to ask folks, and it's basically, if you were to invite 3 dinner guests, it can either be one gathering where all 4 of you, these 3 people and you, or just one-on-one, have a beer with any 3 people or have a meal with any 3 people throughout human history. So either individually, one-on-one, or together. But who would those 3 people be and why?
Right now? Well, I think my first reaction is, I think this is such an important period in human history that if the question were, who would I most like to pick the brain of and learn from and find out what really made them tick, and if they were alive today, would they still think the same sort of thing? that they were saying back then, there's a whole bunch of really interesting cats I'd love to talk to, right?
I'm with you.
But today I would probably be trying to figure out who are the three most important people who are antagonistic to what I think needs to happen. And that would be a tough choice, but I might think about, oh gosh, it's hard to, I would be thinking about someone who I think is going to have the most influence on the conservative right wing in North America. Mm-hmm. And that's a hard one because I'm just not sure, to be honest. But but that archetype, maybe someone from, I think unfortunately from a period of great interest in the sciences to generalize, the Islamic world has gone backwards in reaction against the West and scientific understanding. So I think I'd want to talk to one of the great, perhaps who's the most influential Islamic scholar today. Mm-hmm. And because of the Shiite and Sunni divide, that might take two. I don't know. You think about somebody like Putin, who is become such a regressive figure in terms of that part of the world. So gosh, I feel like I would need some time, but that's the sort of strategy.
Yeah.
But here's the premise of it. I think if you get those people together with tea in the Muslim world or beer somewhere else, and if you can really get people to talk about what they really love and why, you can begin to find common ground. Yeah. And I don't think there's anybody who will say that they want to pass a world down to their children or to future generations if they don't happen to have children, who would say that it would be okay for us to pass down a less ecologically rich world than the one we inherited.
Yeah. Well, there are those for whom end times thinking, apocalyptic thinking, is so front and center that I might disagree with that last statement of yours. For some people, who just
no, you're right. There are some exceptions, but I think that there's even ways to. I'd like to think anyway that you can still find common ground. I mean, even with folks who talk like that, they at least also usually will talk a certain kind of stewardship language that provides a basis for
sure.
building upon. Even though I think if they have that, I guess these are kind of starting place conversations, but if people really have the notion that the sacred is above and beyond this world and there's a big divide between this world and that world, that's a really hard one to overcome.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, one of the things I love about your response is that Connie and I are two of the most mission-driven people that I know. That is, almost every question and everything is sort of filtered through how can this further what our mission is. And that's what I'm hearing from you too, a strategic conversation about who to invite that could move the whole thing forward in a helpful way is just great.
Yeah, well, you need to just be talking to one another. Ultimately, we need to have real, authentic, heartfelt, reality-based conversations, as you put it, with the most important people who are blocking these sorts of understandings from emerging. And we have to break down the insularity somehow. And sometimes the only way to do that is through creative conflict. Right. So there's still a part of me, I'm not metaphysically a Gandhian, who thinks, like I think he thought with his philosophy of conflict, that if one person stands true to the truth, even if that means they change their mind in a conflict situation, the truth will out. I'm not convinced of that. But I like the philosophy of conflict, where we're too averse to difficult conversations, including in our families and our wider circles. We have to speak our truths forthrightly and collegially, and in a way that welcomes which is in a non-judgmental way. And we can do that if we understand how people come to believe what they believe in the first place. We know from the sociology of knowledge that, usually the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. Usually most people will follow the leads of their primary and secondary socializers. So when people believe things that don't make sense to us and we think are kind of regressive vis-a-vis the directions we need to be thinking and going, to a significant extent, that's just understandable. To a significant extent, that's not their fault. So we don't have to come across hubristically and arrogantly, but we can talk about where we started and how our understandings emerged. And frankly, we can talk about how difficult it is sometimes to let go of earlier deeply felt understandings. I have an evangelical background. That wasn't easy emerging out of that and developing a much wider understanding of the universe than when that was so important, helpful, and in many ways healing for me at a certain point in my life.
Yeah.
So, there's no substitute for the personal touch, and one of the biggest problems we face is that there's just not enough people kind of doing what you and Connie are doing, getting out there in the grassroots and having these encounters with people. And I know as much as you can, you're doing that across cultural divides.
Yes, exactly. Cool. Well, my host has come home, so I want to attend to her. I haven't even said hi yet, but you can probably hear a little bit in the background. But before I do, I just want to just ask: where would be the place for people to go, in addition to your book, who want to learn more about you and your work? What website or what would they Google?
Well, I have a website which is just my name, Bron Taylor, BronTaylor.com. And there's a number of books there that I've written or orchestrated. There's also links to one of the things, my long-term interest has been environmental mobilization. So for those who are interested in research into what might mobilize the human animal to responsiveness in these areas, I've been working with other scholars on these things, including with the International Society for the Study of Religion, Nature, and Culture, and I edited a book, a journal with that title. There's sample entries for the Encyclopedia of Religion and Nature, which I edited a number of years ago, which is, I think, a good starting place into some of these issues. So certainly welcome. And there's interviews and some lectures and so forth. So I'm trying to keep that up to date with interesting folks and interesting things for folks who are interested.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and mention my enthusiasm for that Encyclopedia for Religion and Nature, not only because Connie and I each have a
yes, you
contributed essay, but it's just a fabulous resource.
Well, I'm glad you like it.
Cool. Well, Bron, thank you so much. Say hi to Beth for us, and I really appreciate you being part of this.
Talk with you. I've still got to get to those. We had some pretty good interviews back at my place, and I've still got to find time to, those were gems.
Yeah, they really were.
Now that some of these, we should get those online.
That's a great idea, because Connie does YouTube. Yeah.
Because now we can put a lot more. We can get a lot more online, because it used when we were doing those, they were only letting us have 8 minutes or something, right?
Well, and we exactly, Connie, we have 2 YouTube channels, both of which we can have hour-long things on. And Connie's become quite the video editor, and we're going to be in Gainesville for about 3 weeks in January. I think the last 2 weeks in January and the first week in February, we're going to be sort of based in the Gainesville area. Hart and Jeffrey, Hart Phoenix, and they're going to be, so they've got.
You're always welcome to stay here, and now with the kids gone, you don't even have to sleep in your truck, So if Hart and Jeffrey aren't around the whole time, or if you just want a little less driving to town,
okay,
we'd love to see you. I'll put a note on my calendar and try to steer other things, out of town runs, away from there. We'd love to see you guys.
Yeah, well, we plan on it. We'd like to spend some real quality time with you.
Well, the other thing that, Kelsey graduated since we last saw you from the film school at USC.
Uh-huh.
And she's been doing associate producer stuff on various things. And there may be documentary possibilities down the road.
Mm-hmm.
I was approached about doing a Dark Green Religion documentary, and by Wes Skiles. a Nat Geo guy, and then unfortunately he was a diver, and he really was especially taken by the aquatic side of that book. Mm-hmm. And he unfortunately had a diving accident and passed away.
Oh, God.
Yeah, but there's still a desire to do something like that, and your stuff is totally amenable and should be a part of. He actually thought it once he heard once he actually read the book, he said, "This isn't a one-off. This should be a series."
Right, exactly. Right?
And I don't know what the title would be, but what you two have been doing should be a part of that, just as you were at least one of the cast of characters in the Dark Green Religion book. So anyway, that might afford us a chance to brainstorm about some future collaborations.
That's great. And I just got notice this morning that my latest TEDx talk, the one that I did just a few weeks ago in Grand Rapids, Michigan, is online. So I'll send you the link to that. I was pretty pleased. It's called Reality Reconciles Science and Religion.
Well, I'll blast that around the world.
Cool. For sure. All right, Bron, this has been fabulous. Thank you so much.
Give my best to Connie, and also I'll certainly greet you from Beth, and we love you guys, and
love you too.
Great respect.
Yes, I hope.
So glad you're healthy, my friend.
Thank you. Me too.
Keep it up.
Okay, thanks.
Take care. Bye-bye.